We've talked a lot on this channel about how the Russian government is paying huge salaries to pull in some of their poorest citizens to fight and die in Ukraine. But is the math actually favorable for Russia and for these families? Just why are they cheering as their brothers and husbands are sent off to die in Ukraine? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about this insane and pretty grisly story. Okay, so this is some interesting math that's actually originally done by Fortune, pointing out that in Russia, some men may be worth more dead than alive. This is according to economic analysis, right? This isn't a value reflection of the value of a Russian male, but based on the the rate of alcoholism in Russia, it may also be true, kind of morally. So this is an estimate by a Russian economist. A family of a 35-year-old man who serves in the front lines for a year and is then killed in action would earn about $150,000 in the form of salary and death compensation if they were to sign up under the current bonus structure. Now, that doesn't include other bonuses or insurance payouts not handled by the governments. But in some regions of Russia, particularly its poorest regions, that is more than that man would earn working the average job as a civilian, even if he were to work until the age of 60, right? So to put things in context, guys, that would be the average salary in the U.S., that we can look at the average salary in a state like Mississippi. Actually, let's look at the median salary, right? So you look at the median salary in a state like Mississippi, again, 35 years old, you're looking at about $58,000 a year. And so when we run that, we do a little bit of napkin math, right? And we say, okay, so a 35-year-old is earning, we said, $58,000 a year, and let's just assume he's going to continue to earn that until his 60s when he stops working. So that's 25 years. So that's the equivalent of getting a $1.5 million payout by U.S. standards, right? This, again, imagine going to rural Mississippi and saying, listen, all we need is able-bodied men, and if you could survive a year, $1.5 million. Guys, you would absolutely, and by the way, Russia also draws from prison. So imagine knocking on the door of a prison and saying, listen, you do this, 1.5 mil in your family's accounts. It's a no-brainer for these Russians. He literally calls them deathonomics in wartime Russia. And the fact is that this windfall is really helping. Right? Poverty rates have fallen to the lowest level since Russia began gathering that data in 1995. Because this, again, makes sense that these families are getting. Again, imagine going to the poorest regions, the Mississippis, the Alabamas, the Appalachians of the United States, and offering every single family, if you can put up one able-bodied man, you'll get a $1.5 million payout, right? And able-bodied is sort of a stretch, right? In the U.S., we say, oh, you have depression, you have color blindness, you need glasses, you can't join. Russia doesn't have those standards. Diabetes, alcoholism, cardiovascular issues, doesn't matter. Oh, and by the way, he's using 35 as his metric, but the average age of a Russian recruit now is actually 50, right? Now, this is not sustainable for Russia. As of June, Russia's paid out over $30 billion in the last year. Particularly heavy are the Tuva and Buryatia regions. These are two of the poorest regions in Russia. But bank deposits have more than doubled, or nearly doubled, in these two regions since January, indicating that families are getting huge paydays somehow. Again, so much that even impoverished regions, which generally impoverished people are going to spend all of their money, that's sort of definitionally how poverty works, even they're able to save some of this money. So, right, the problem is that these folks die. And the other problem, though that's lesser a problem, we're going to talk about that, why it's actually might be even good for Russia. But this has contributed to high inflation, putting it at 10%. But we know that the secret real inflation rate, based on things like food prices, is actually closer to about 25%. That's why the central bank, of course, has hiked its benchmark rate to 21%. And again, it says GDP growth looks good, but you cannot do this forever, right? The Russian economy, by most estimates, has about a year of this kind of fake spending left. Think of it like sort of like a COVID type of spend. Remember, in the United States, we shut down all the businesses, all the real economic activity, but the US government paid businesses, business owners, and individuals with big fat checks in a lot of cases. And that sort of created this fake economy that was fueled by government debt and spending. Now, could the US government do it for a couple of months during COVID before it had to open back up? Yeah, it could. But could the U.S. government have sustained an economy like that for years, as Russia's trying to do with its wartime policies? No, of course not. It would be a disaster. The economy would get overcooked, and eventually employment would plummet because, again, these government payouts, they don't create jobs, right? These people aren't actually producing economically valuable activity, right? War is destructive. It destroys economies. It's not growing economies. Now, before we talk about why I actually think this math is good for Putin and Russia, I wanted to mention, of course, that if you want access to uncensored combat footage and support me and this channel, you want to do it over on combatvetnews.com. This is my version of Patreon, but the members get access to not just an archive of hundreds of combat videos going back to the start of the war with deep dive analysis, but we drop new videos twice a week. We just took a look at some reporting from the Liut Brigade in Touretsk, not too far at all, just a few kilometers from where I was on my Ukraine trip. So if you want to support the channel and make sure we can continue to do this kind of reporting, to help us out on combatvetnews.com. Links in the description. Okay. So the average age of a Russian recruit, as we've talked about, is about 50 years old. And when you look at these Russian recruits, or you look at the average life expectancy of a Russian, you can see that it really is very low, especially by European standards. It's one of the lowest life expectancies in the world, right? With 60, basically in 2012, they had a life expectancy of 64. It hasn't hardly gone up, right? It's now about 67, and that's almost an all-time high for men. But that implies that, again, if the average age of a Russian recruit, is about 50, right, then let's see if we can find the actual stats here. Right, according to Moscow's mayor's office, that the number of older volunteers has grown in August. The average age of contract soldiers was about 40 in 2024 to about 50 now. So you're talking about a man, these guys getting recruited here. Again, here's another example of the life expectancy, about 65. You're looking at, again, someone with about 15 years of economically productive life remaining. But in a place like Russia, there's more complications. And that is that the reason Russian men have these very short lifespans is not because of anything inherent to Russian DNA, right? Russians that move to the United States basically have life expectancies like other white males, right? So the fact is that in Russia, drinking, cardiovascular disease, unhealthy lifestyles are overwhelmingly the source of mortality. And so these are, basically cardiovascular disease and cancer, the two number 1 and 2 killers, but they're killing people very early. There's also external causes of death like suicide, road accidents, murders, alcohol poisoning, accidental drowning, which is another alcohol-related disease, taking up another 11%. So this is really until 2007, Russia was actually the world leader in smoking as well, though that's been coming down recently. And of course, Russians drink an average of 26 pints of pure alcohol per year, 3 times as high as they did in 1990. It's reported that excessive alcohol consumption is blamed for half of all premature deaths in Russia, and about half of all deaths among men are alcohol related. So here's the thing, guys. If you've ever known an alcoholic, yeah, sometimes they die easy, right? Sometimes they run their car into a tree, boom, dead, no cost to the healthcare system. But in Russia, you have to remember that that is very expensive to treat a dying person. In fact, in the United States, when someone is in the last year or two of their life, they basically incur something like 90% of all the medical costs they're ever going to cost. So they spend the first 95% of their life, or 98% of their life, paying into the medical system through insurance, and then they basically draw that money out in the last 2 years as they sort of circle the drain. And this is something that's just kind of inherent to how medicine operates. And that's going to be true of these Russian citizens as well. Not only that, but by recruiting them at 50, Russia is getting a great deal because they've paid into state pension systems their whole lives. They've paid into state medical systems their whole lives. Now they're in their 40s and 50s. They're only going to live another 15 years. They're going to develop serious health problems. They're probably going to stop working soon anyway. Oh yeah, remember, Russia has a demographic crisis. So by drawing in 40 and 50-year-olds, right, how many 40 and 50-year-olds do you know are having more kids? Not that many. So they've reproduced all they're going to reproduce. They've basically worked almost all that they're going to work. And they have not started to draw heavily on the medical system. And so Russia says, listen, we're basically euthanizing these people in order to paying them to euthanize themselves and in the process, maybe reveal some Ukrainian combat positions so drones can kill them. So it sounds like some grisly math, but if you're a dictator like Putin, this is the reality that you're sort of stuck with, is that he's actually thinks he's winning. And he sort of is in a creepy eugenics kind of way. He's finding his most unproductive citizens and wiping them off the face of the earth. But that's not all. Because remember, you know who is one of the most expensive types of citizens for any state to have is a prisoner. Why? Because a prisoner has to be fed, housed, receive medical care, and then is also part of a very expensive legal process. Remember, judges draw salaries, prosecutors draw salaries, guards draw salaries. These are very expensive. Prisons are not cheap. And Putin has said, listen, if you are at any point in the legal process, if you've been arrested, charged, on trial, serving a sentence, you can get your sentence suspended as long as you sign that military contract, right? And if you survive, which won't happen, you can have your criminal record expunged, right? So they say that the only felonies it doesn't include are serious crimes like treason, espionage, terrorism, and certain sex crimes. So this is, again, a huge money-making opportunity for Russia because essentially they just have to do a one-time payment. Because remember, surviving a year at the front, guys, before getting killed is preposterously long by Russian standards. Typically, these guys are going to last weeks at the front, is for a Russian infantryman, and that's who these guys are, right? Drone pilots and other professionals, they are not going to be, they're just not drawn from the same ilk. They're not drawn from the same group. They're volunteers, they're contract soldiers, they're longer serving soldiers. Specialists just aren't subject to this in the Russian military. But Russian infantry, yeah, this is how they go out. They don't live very long. So Putin gets a great deal. In exchange for a one-time payment, instead of covering the cost of dealing with them forever, the state simply gets rid of them, doesn't take a demographic hit because they're older or because they're in prison. And it gets to save all of this money in its healthcare, its pension system, all of it. So for Putin, and Putin gets his war machine. War machine gets to eat. So anyway, guys, that's all I had. I hope you guys got some value out of this one. I certainly found it very interesting. Thanks to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., and Ida Skycall, as well as our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do it without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.